I'm Elliot Gerson, Executive Vice President of the Institute, and I have no particular expertise in this topic, but a fascination in it. And let me say that the topic, as I think all of you know, is Colorado's right to try law, Lifeline or false hope. And what's important to know is this is not a parochial issue because we happen to be here in Colorado. And this law, the first of its kind in the country, was signed, Governor, about 5 weeks ago.
That's right.
But this is legislation that is likely to be enacted in many other states. It's already on the legislative agenda of 3 or 4 other states. We'll probably talk a little bit about the politics of it. As I was discussing it with Governor Garcia earlier, the vote in the legislature in Colorado was actually unanimous in support of this legislation. And I think the politics are really quite interesting. But not only is it legislation that many other states are looking at, but it's actually of global significance, also like our conference today, looking not just at US issues, but global issues. Our panelists, Lieutenant Governor Joe Garcia. It's always a privilege and a pleasure for us here in Aspen to host one of the distinguished leaders of the state that we call home. He is a very distinguished educator before his political career. He's a past president of both a university and a community college. He's passionate about higher education equity issues, and he's also a very respected figure dealing with K through 12 equity issues. Diane Meier is the director of the Center to Advance Palliative Care, and she's also a nationally respected geriatrician, a medical educator, a medical ethicist, and I think both with her geriatrics perspective and her ethics perspective will be a very important person to hear from about the issues that are raised by this legislation. The legislation, and I think most of you have a basic idea of what the legislation does, which allows the terminally ill to obtain drugs outside clinical trials, outside the FDA's own compassionate use guidelines, and the drugs have to have passed phase 1 of the FDA procedures, but not gone beyond that. Supporters call it hope for the terminally ill, frustrated by what they describe as the red tape relating to the federal guidelines to obtain potentially life-saving or at least life-extending drugs. Many call it the Dallas Buyers Club bill or the Dallas Buyers Club law, of course, because of that film and the extraordinary success it had, including Matthew McConaughey's Best Actor award, gave great currency to some of the issues. A patient who smuggled treatments from Mexico that were not approved in this country and then distributed them to other people with AIDS in Texas. So the support comes from people who look at it as an extraordinary opportunity to help people who are very desperate and have no alternatives. But there's also been a lot of criticism and skeptics about the bill, although you might not see that reflected in the vote in the Colorado legislature. Some have said, while saying, perhaps it was a great movie, albeit one based on facts that were not, in fact, accurate about what happened at the time, but actually the source of what some people describe as actually terrible public policy. Some critics call it empty, feel-good legislation that won't actually help anyone, and others at the extreme call it flat-out cruel, or I read one commentary called it a Trojan duck, meaning something that would allow sellers of quack medicine into the state. But most of the people who are critical of it seem to have had very little influence in Colorado. The Colorado medical societies took essentially no opinion on the bill. The hospitals didn't take didn't take an opinion. The health insurers didn't express an opinion. And the FDA itself has taken, as I understand it, I don't think Peggy Hamburg is here yet, or we could ask her directly, she'll be here tomorrow, taken a position, but however has noted, of course, that today patients do get access to experimental treatments, either through clinical trials or if the patient doesn't qualify to apply for access without a trial. So let me start with you, Governor, and I've alluded a couple of times to the politics of it. How did this legislation pass with unanimity?
Well, it's a really good question, and it's something that frankly we did not anticipate. Now, I want to be real clear, this was not one of the governor's agenda bills. This kind of came as a surprise to us as well. And it's important to note that two of the prime sponsors were one senator, one representative in our legislature who are both medical doctors, and they supported. One was a prime sponsor and the other was a supporter. What was interesting is that nobody stepped up to oppose it. So I think when it first came up, a lot of us assumed it was not going to get many votes and it was going to die a quick death. But you mentioned it was a feel-good bill, as if that was bad or unusual. Well, it may be bad, but it's certainly not unusual. A lot of what happens in legislatures is we pass bills that make people feel good. I mean, whether we're talking about things that are innocuous, like license plate bills for people who served in Korea, or this bill, which seems so much more significant, we pass a lot of bills because our constituents come to us and say, this is important. And nobody else says, well, we feel strongly, negatively about it. Now, it's also important to remember that Colorado is a state that looks very critically on any laws that really infringe on individual rights. We need to be sure that before we infringe on an individual right, I won't say a constitutional right, but an individual right, that there's a good and valid reason for it. And that's why Colorado is in the front not only with this bill, but of course you know about our not just medical marijuana, but now recreational marijuana. And we are kind of out front, even though I will tell you, quite honestly, the governor did not want Colorado to be out front on these things. It just happened to us, and we are working with it. But again, the real key here is we've got a governing philosophy that says we don't want to infringe on individual rights unless there's a compelling state interest. And and nobody showed up to say this did that. Nobody showed up.
Why do you think they didn't show up?
Because nobody likes to say no to people who are suffering. These are the kind of bills that pass based on very compelling personal stories, very emotional stories. Those things carry a lot of weight in front of a legislature, and no legislator, frankly, wants to be the one to say, I don't care that this might have helped your mother live an extra month. I don't think it's worth it in terms of what it might mean to public safety overall, or to our accepted methodology for confirming that drugs are not only safe but effective. Nobody wants to say to that person, we're going to deny you that right.
But it is interesting. These bills are not new. My understanding is that actually many of these bills were drafted by an organization in Arizona, very libertarian organization, and they've been proposed for a decade. And they've never received this kind of support. They've never been enacted. And so, in fact, many people are saying the Dallas Buyers Club actually has had a significant effect. But you say it's feel good for the legislators, but do you think, practically speaking, it's going to make any of your constituents actually feel better than they would otherwise? Isn't that the point of the bill?
That is the point of the bill. And first, with respect to Dallas Buyers Club, you're right. These bills have been introduced before. But this really, I think, drives home the impact of popular culture on policy decisions. We can't pretend that that doesn't have an impact, whether we're talking about civil unions or gay marriage or recreational marijuana or a right to try bill. And we see that TV shows, whether we're talking about the Cosbys or Modern Family or the Dallas Buyers Club, does drive public policy. It makes people think about things in a different way. And that's what happened here.
And even if in the Dallas Buyers Club, most of the things brought in from Mexico actually had no positive effect, and ironically, the one drug that could have helped people, and this was 30 plus years ago, And it was, by the way, before the FDA had a compassionate use policy. So the attacking of the FDA in it really was, would not apply today. But the one drug that could have helped, the protagonist actually called toxic and poison, and that was AZT. So in fact, the irony is that the facts in that movie, as compelling as it was, were not accurate. But Diane, how do you see the politics of this? I mean, it does seem as if when you have, a dying parent or a dying child, and saying, why can't I have a chance? Yeah. It's pretty difficult to react against that. Yeah. Yet many people are responsibly saying that the effects of this either are going to be nil because the FDA still approves these drugs. These drugs are not necessarily going to be safe. Mm-hmm. And many of these drugs, in fact, for people who are seriously ill, are likely to shorten their life or cause their last months to be even in greater pain.
Well, snake oil sales has a long and valiant history in humanity. I mean, there have always been people proffering false hope to desperate, terrified people. And this is sort of a modern example of that. We also have a very strong anti-government, anti-bureaucracy society these days.
Yeah, I mean, those attitudes are increasing.
Yeah, and they're increasing. So no one's going to tell me not to smoke pot, and no one's going to tell me I can't take experimental treatment when I'm sick, and that, I think, is behind the politics of this. But for an individual person with a serious illness that is likely to lead to their death, if it were me, I would want access to whatever might give me a chance. I would want evidence that I wasn't taking poison, and these drugs have to go through phase 1 clinical trials, so that those are safety trials,
yeah, but
toxicity
that's only the
trials.
First stage.
Right.
I mean, they're still not necessarily safe until.
I believe me, I know, but I can understand. It's easy for us to say when we're healthy that we wouldn't want unsafe, untested drugs. Having taken care of a lot of people who are facing death, it's easy to judge the desperation and terror that people feel. And so I'm trying not to do that. But I do think it's important to recognize the opportunity cost. Because what is the cost of spending the last weeks or months of your life in a desperate search for a miracle cure? What do you not do because you're doing that? And that's what I think doesn't get included in these debates. There are very important developmental tasks in the last weeks and months of life. And those developmental tasks range from getting your affairs in order to, most importantly, completing important relationships. So your estranged son who you haven't seen in 6 years, your fight with your black sheep child, saying thank you, forgive me, I forgive you, I love you, goodbye. You never get that opportunity back.
Well, but Dr. Gerson,
if someone doesn't say to you, these are the developmental tasks, these are the things that need to happen, you'll be hooked up to an IV in an ICU somewhere, and your family will never get that opportunity, and you will give up that opportunity. And what my concern is that people won't know what they're giving up.
That's true, Dr. Meier, but isn't it a rather paternalistic view of government for government to say, palliative care is the better approach, and you should take it, and you should reach out, you should get your affairs in order. I mean, that is the choice I would make, but I don't believe, it's obviously not the choice everybody makes. And to call it snake oil, although, this does not exclude doctors from the process. A medical doctor has to agree that this is a process that nothing else has worked, and this might. So, and we're also not discounting safety, because stage 1 is about demonstrating safety, not toxicity, but it, granted, doesn't demonstrate efficacy, but we're not arguing that it should. I mean, one, in fact, could pass a law just as easily that says stage 1 shouldn't even be in there. I mean, anything should be in. And so we do need to be thoughtful about what is the benefit to society for government to intrude on an individual decision about whether they want to pursue a snake oil remedy as opposed to spending their last few weeks in a way that you and I might feel is more appropriate.
So I'm not opposed to this legislation because I understand people's desire to try everything and anything. and
But you do see significant
I
risks.
see significant downside. So if I were making policy on this, I would require that people who pursue this kind of treatment, in addition to having a physician recommend it, hopefully a competent physician, and
That's a whole
not
different
all
question.
physicians are competent. I'm sure you're aware of that. So there are plenty of physicians who do things that are not safe, that are ineffective, in spite of having a medical license. So let me just say that. But I would require that people who choose this route are also given concordant, simultaneous palliative care that helps focus on their quality of life, their relationships, their pain, their shortness of breath, their depression, their anxiety. So it's not either or, it's both and. Both at the same time.
And one of the interesting things about this legislation is it does, in fact, say that you might be excluded from hospice care if you choose to pursue an experimental drug. And it does seem that it's unfortunate that it's mutually exclusive. I would say we do recognize that not all doctors are good, but we have other processes in place to identify those. All of our states have medical boards. All of us look at appropriate standards of conduct, and all of us make decisions about pulling doctors' licenses. But as we learned with medical marijuana, we have some doctors who will happily prescribe where another doctor might not. I don't think that's unique, though, to this situation.
No, it's not.
Joe, can you explain how this is going to work practically? As I understand the legislation, pharmaceutical companies are allowed to provide drugs, but they're not required to provide the drugs. And if they wish to provide the drugs, they're even allowed to charge for the drugs, whereas under the FDA compassionate use procedures, they cannot charge for the drugs. It's also my understanding, I may be wrong, that most pharmaceutical companies are opposed to this legislation and have indicated that they don't expect to be providing drugs. So practically speaking, given the fact that there is an FDA procedure, and the FDA, when people apply for compassionate use, apparently green light about 99% of those requests. So help me understand why this is not just feel good and actually is going to lead to any individuals receiving an effective drug.
May not. There's no question. The way this works is it just allows you to bypass the FDA approval process or the FDA waiver process, which the FDA says accurately they grant most of the time. On the other hand, the proponents of this bill say it takes too long, it's too cumbersome, and most folks don't pursue it. So let us skip that. Now, you're right. The pharmaceutical companies are not required to provide the device or the drug or the treatment that is being sought. Not at all. And I don't know that it will change anything. But on the other hand, one of the things we can look at is it's not unusual for states to decide to say to the federal government, we want to pass legislation that in some ways is sending a message that is symbolic and that says to you, our citizens are frustrated with this process and you ought to change it. Now, the FDA process exists, frankly, because we want it to. I mean, we want to be protected from snake oil, and yet when we look at that snake oil, if we want to call it that, as the only thing that might save us, most of us would choose to get it any way we could.
But what if we thought that it might, but on the other hand, the likelihood is it could, we're desperately ill, many of these drugs are extraordinarily potent, that it could actually hasten our death and cause much greater suffering in our last months to engage in the kinds of things that you, from your experience, believe are so important.
It's not only physical suffering, it's also the number of families I have seen bankrupted because of a loved one's desperate search for the miracle cure, leaving their wife penniless, leaving their children penniless, because individuals are going to have to pay for these drugs. Insurers are not going to pay for them. Medicare and Medicaid are not going to pay for them. Because there's no evidentiary basis, and the pharma is not going to give them free. So we're not only feeding this desperate fear as opposed to appropriately taking care of the seriously ill, we are, government is allowing people to bankrupt themselves. So I think the state does have an interest in protecting people from that.
Right. Well, medical care, unfortunately, has often been allocated based on individual wealth. And one of the criticisms I have of this bill is that it does say, okay, insurance companies don't have to provide it, the drug companies don't have to provide it for free, hospitals don't have to agree to treat you if it does hurt you, and your state can be liable for any expenses you don't cover. So it can do exactly what you're talking about. But people are making that decision knowingly with the advice of a doctor, and there's a very tight informed consent provision of this law that says, I've been advised, I have to say in writing, I'm willing to accept both the physical, medical, and economic consequences of my decision. I want to do it. And you and I know, despite all of those things, many people desperate to stay alive or family members will say, do it anyway.
But doesn't the state have a role to actually protect those vulnerable people? And what is the meaning of informed consent when a drug may have just passed phase 1, maybe 20 people involved in it, and all it's demonstrated is not that it's extremely toxic, at least to those 20 people. Most drugs, I think, 5% of cancer drugs that pass through the whole process. They have found in phase 2 and phase 3 that they are highly toxic or not
phase
efficacious.
1 is supposed to really may not be, again, effective, but they generally are ruled not toxic. But what you're asking is for public policymakers, legislators, who frankly people don't trust, to make a medical decision that may overrule what a doctor, who people do trust. People trust their doctors. Frankly, they don't trust their legislators or their governor, especially with a medical decision. So they say, why should you put yourself in the place, my doctor has agreed this treatment might help me, or at least that no other treatment will help me. So legislators, get out of the way. And so that is one of the things that legislators and governors have to do all the time.
So here's another example of a state legalizing something that one could argue the state has a strong interest in preventing. Let's take Oregon and Washington State's Death with Dignity Act. Also a law that depends critically on the competency of the physician. The competency of the physician to assess the person who says, I want to die quickly, to make sure that the reason isn't something that is remediable, like a treatable depression, or a feeling of guilt for having failed the doctor and not responded well to chemotherapy. 9 out of 10 requests for a hastened death are not actually suicidal. They're actually about something else. I promise you that maybe 1 out of 10 doctors is skilled enough to distinguish those motivations. So I was opposed to those laws, not because I don't believe in people's right to control the timing of their own death, but because I don't trust the lowest common denominator of physician to protect patients from doing things that the doctor could have recognized but failed to recognize could be handled in a different way.
All too true. But again, I think the public is really who we are responsive to.
Right.
And the laws you're talking about, we've seen some evolution. And who knows, maybe somebody makes a blockbuster movie about that and we end up with a bill. That's entirely possible. I'm not denying that. That is often what shapes the public debate.
Yep.
But we do know, you talked about the lowest common denominator doctor. That person is still trusted more than the highest common denominator politician. That's a sad fact.
That's a sad truth.
And politicians like myself who are not medically trained, we don't know. So we would say, how can we not defer to the judgment of a trained doctor? And they may be competent, but they may not be ethical. And those two things, I think, they're not always lined up. And we, again, saw that with medical marijuana, which was intended, as when it was passed, I thought it'd be treating glaucoma in cancer patients. Instead, the average medical marijuana card holder is a 24-year-old male skateboarder. It's probably not suffering from glaucoma.
Right.
But they got their medical marijuana card.
Yep.
So
Diane,
that's a challenge.
You talked a minute ago about the terminally ill person desperate for a miracle.
Right.
And I mean, isn't part of what's going on here a sense that many people have that there are lots of miracle drugs out there that are just being denied to us?
Well, and how do you think they got that sense that there are lots of miracle drugs out there? Watch TV. I mean, there are people making a lot of money selling that perception that we can fix everything.
But sadly, that perception is flat out wrong.
Of course it's wrong. But actually, if you've got...
I mean, everyone thinks this, Gleevec was, was the exception.
Well, I mean, the fact is, it depends on the patient population. Most people understand that every life ends in death and that the mortality rate, newsflash, remains at 100%. And it's actually very few older people who pursue wildly experimental, desperate things. It's more typically younger, middle-aged, or younger people. And in my experience, and I've taken care of many patients who want that miracle cure, a skilled clinician can get at what is behind the terror, can ask the person to say more about what they are afraid of. And that requires training, it requires skill, it requires time, which doctors don't have. They don't have the training, the skill, or the time. But a doctor who has those things can very often make that last phase of life the most precious and valuable that person ever had. But it requires skill, not quick fixes, and not, oh, I'll just order another PET scan and order some more chemo and get you out of my office, because I don't have time.
Governor, why wouldn't the same logic apply to people who have chronic diseases and suffer great pain? Why shouldn't they be able to take whatever they want? You know, who cares whether the FDA has said it's actually efficacious? It's my right to take something that I think is going to reduce my pain, even if it might kill me.
Well, it's precisely people of our generation, the baby boomers, who are reluctant to age, who are struggling hard to hold on to our imagined youth. I mean, if there was something out there that would regrow my hair, I'd pay for it. But think about, you know, the low testosterone. How many ads we see now that would suggest that every man of my age suffers from low T and that can be treated. And then following that, within a year, you see all the ads from lawyers suggesting if you received low T treatment and you had this side effect, come to us and we'll sue that provider of testosterone treatment. You know, it is about money, but it's also about providing what people want. And what people want is to delay, in some cases, death, and in some cases, simply aging. We don't want to be wrinkled, we don't want to be old, we don't want to be able to, we don't want to have to admit we can't do what we could do 20 years ago.
And Governor, you're, I think, a lawyer, or you?
I am a lawyer by training.
Right. Does the state expect that there may be a challenge to this on federal preemption grounds, or do you think the FDA and the federal government is afraid of those ads about dying babies and dying parents and doesn't want to come in and just say, look, the FDA, you know, preempts this? I mean, one possibility is that no responsible pharmaceutical company is going to provide a drug. They have a process already, and the only ones that might are, in fact, peddling quack cures, or an in-state Colorado pharmaceutical company that does not operate outside of Colorado and thereby may not be preempted.
Well, remember, there is a requirement that it has to have passed the stage 1 FDA trial. So that is still a requirement. Now, you're right. I mean, even the bill sponsors, when I talked to the sponsors, including those who are doctors, they said, you're right, the practical effect may be nil. It may be that not a single pharmaceutical company out there is willing to do it, despite all the things we put into the bill to kind of encourage them to do so. You know, why is it in their interest? And certainly, though we saw, again...
Why do they not want to do it? It's not because they're cruel. It's not because they don't want to save this dying baby or dying 32-year-old mother of twins.
No, they don't. They want to be sure, again, that they don't do anything that interferes with their ability to get to stage 2 and stage 3 and stage 4 approval and ultimately on the market. They do worry that whatever's written into state law that somebody could still legally challenge and say, we still think because of the FDA and the federal requirements, you're still liable. But you're right, federal preemption is an issue. It was the issue with passage of both medical marijuana and recreational marijuana as well. So far, the feds have kind of taken a cautious approach. They haven't stormed in, but we've seen that because of other federal prohibitions, you know, the marijuana industry, for example, is not advanced as far as it could because banks won't take their money because of federal law. So, you know, there are other things that get in the way, and the feds still having a prohibition might make this law absolutely ineffective, other than to the extent that it sends a message to the federal government and the FDA that we want you to ease up on those approval processes and not require a 100-page application that will take months for approval because I might be dead by then.
So you seem ambivalent about this. If
I think any rational person would be ambivalent about it.
Arizona, Missouri, I mean, if they asked you to come and testify, you'd say no because, you know, on the one hand, on the other hand, do what you want.
Well, I mean, this is a democracy. right? And the people's will determines the law. And I understand why this is a popular law and why all the legislators voted for it, because it feels like, why not? It's a desperately ill, terminally ill person.
Why didn't they vote for it 5 years ago and
Well,
7 years ago?
for
One
whatever.
movie?
Maybe the movie, maybe the success of recreational marijuana, maybe a sense that the public is going to hold them to this and not reelect them if they don't do it.
An increasing sense that people don't trust government.
Which is certainly true. But as I said, I think there are real costs. I think pharmaceutical companies would be crazy to provide these drugs because all they have to do is kill somebody. And, you know, that's it. They could easily be sued by the family, the surviving family, for giving a toxic drug that had only been through phase 1 testing. The family could say, you hastened my loved one's death.
So why support it if you're convinced that no responsible pharmaceutical company is going to provide a drug?
It's not a matter of support or not support. I understand the fears and the public desire for this.
What about other issues where you've got emotion on one side and science on the other?
This is why I was opposed to the Death with Dignity Act, because public policy has to protect the public from the lowest common denominator. I believe it is a public policy responsibility to protect the public from predictable risk.
What about physician-assisted suicide? What's different about that and this?
They're very similar,
yeah,
I think.
If the logic applies here, why shouldn't it apply to me if I'm ill and I don't want to suffer and I want to die, and who's to tell me that I can't die?
No one's to tell you that you can't die.
The way I want to die.
You can.
With a physician helping me commit suicide.
Well, okay, so you're talking to someone who wrote, after Kevorkian, an article in the New England Journal called Morals and Moralism in the debate on physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia, arguing that the medical profession's excessive scrupulosity was ignoring the real express needs of patients and families. Then I started taking care of people who were asking me for help committing suicide. And one after another were depressed, very guilty about having abused a child, you know, and thought they deserved to die because as a punishment for their sins. Someone else felt guilty because she had failed her oncologist by having her cancer progress. It took me learning to be a better doctor to understand that it wasn't a settled rational conviction. It was about something else that could be handled in a different way. And I learned how hard it is to do that and how hard it is to really understand that. And we're talking about life and death here. This is the ultimate kind of obligation of government.
But we're talking about individual decisions, and that is not
the
the ultimate obligation of
But they
government.
have to be informed.
But someone who comes to you and says, my life is worthless and I don't want to live a day longer and I want your help, you can provide it or choose not to, but that individual is going to make a decision one way or another about whether they want to end their life. And I'm not sure that government, we can say suicide is illegal. I'm not sure that changes things much. How many of you out there think motorcycle riders should be required to wear a helmet, and that law should require that? Why?
Because
it's
taxpayers
dangerous.
pay for their crash in the ER.
I'm a motorcyclist, I should admit. Now first, so how many of you recognizing that motorcyclists, even with a helmet, are far more likely to be injured and cost taxpayers money? How many think we should outlaw motorcycles? I mean, it's a line drawing question we face all the time, right? Cars, seatbelts, motorcycles, helmets, experimental drugs that have passed stage 1. We really do, I mean, that's what government is about. It's about line drawing and trying to figure out what's the right balance of interests. And I'm ambivalent about this law too. I would not have voted for it. But on the other hand, I see why the legislators, where even those who are ambivalent, were not willing to publicly vote against it.
Yeah, no, I see that too, if they want to be
well,
reelected.
now that all of you are used to raising your hands, I am going to turn things over to the audience. Do we have microphones that we can, because all of this is being videotaped, so do we have microphones ready?
There's a question back there in the middle.
Okay, and there's a question in the middle, in the back, and then I will move around the room. Yeah, in the green sweater, I think.
Thanks. Hi. Andy Shin. So I just wanted to put a finer point on Diane and Elliot's point about informed consent. And I think that if you think about informed consent and its origins, I think even back to the Hippocratic Oath in terms of beneficence, is really where its origins were. It was something that the U.S. court system created to protect patients, actually to empower patients in holding providers liable. Because there's no way that a patient would ever know as much as a provider knows. So in a world of right to try, recognizing Diane's point that not all providers are going to have all the information, and even those that think they might have all the information may not have all the information, and they even have less information than they would if it was completely cleared by the FDA. So in that case, are we now creating an environment where providers are under even more risk for medical liability? And in fact, aren't we also putting patients in a position that's almost backwards in terms of their, I'll use the word liberty, in terms of their ability to have all the facts and have as much of an informed opinion about medical decision making as possible?
Well, I'll answer that. I mean, first, there's no point at which we can say a patient has all the information, or a doctor has all the information. They have the information that's available given the current state of the science, but that may not be complete. Certainly when we used to use bloodletting and leeches, I mean, people were making decisions based on what they thought worked. This informed consent isn't something that's entirely up to the patient. It does require a doctor to consult with the patient and to inform the patient, among other things, that the use of the drug might in fact hasten their death or might make their remaining weeks or months of life even more unpleasant. But a patient may still say, I'm going to take my chances. Thank you for telling me all that. I don't want to die. And that is ultimately a liberty decision. It may not be a sound decision, but it's an individual choice.
Yep.
Over here.
Hi, I'm Jeremy Faust from Mount Sinai. Dr. Meier, hello.
Hi.
First, I'm the person who said I would ban motorcycles because I'm an emergency doctor. And this particular disease seems to create a lot of single families. And so that's why I speak to that. But my question is about research. Does this law actually undercut equipoise? The idea, if someone with end-stage cancer says, oh, I want the drug, currently we randomize them to get a placebo or the current practice and then the new drug. And that's how leukemia rates have gone in children, death rates being high to very low. Does this law undercut that? So if someone says, I want this drug, I don't want the placebo, I don't want to risk it, I want the right to this medication. So get me out of the trial. Are we going to end up with no progress? But will research be undercut? Is my question.
The two things aren't mutually exclusive. I mean, that you could have a patient who says, yeah, I don't want the placebo, give me this thing whether it works or not, I want to try it. And then, of course, that doesn't interfere with the drug company's right, in fact, obligation to go forward with those randomized studies that we see in stage 2, 3, and 4. So I don't think, again, the two are mutually exclusive.
This is a tension between the right of the individual and what's in the best interest of society. And you can't have it both ways. I mean, the best interest of society is to properly test drugs. That means the week before a drug is released to the market, somebody can't get it, right? Because we have processes that serve the greater good. And that's the ethical tension, the rights of the whole versus the right of the individual.
Doctor, don't we now have breast cancer patients who survive at a much higher rate than they did 20 years ago, being treated, and I'm not a doctor, so I'm just speculating, treated with drugs that had gone through stage 1, but hadn't advanced through the process through full FDA approval. But had they been available to some of those patients earlier, some of those patients might have survived. I mean, it's a hard thing to know, but we certainly don't know that's not the case.
Yeah, no, we can't know that. But, you know, probably 99 to 1 are the drugs that get through phase 1 but are found to be completely ineffective in phases 2, 3, and 4 in terms of the number of drugs that don't make it to market because they either turn out to be very toxic or ineffective after phase 1 trials, far outnumber the effective drugs that make it to market. That's why drugs cost so much, because it costs so much to develop them.
Question in the front. Microphone.
Thank you. I have first a comment and then a question. So from what I understand of your explanation of the right to try law, it's similar to compassionate use. The voters have identified the particular problem as the rate of FDA approval on a compassionate use and the duration of time the FDA takes to come up with their decision in compassionate use. First of all, is that correct?
It's mostly correct. I will say the advocates for it, I think, probably don't have such a nuanced view. They don't want to go through the FDA. They want less government. Right. And it's that simple. They want less government involved.
So the problem with that position, though, is that the FDA isn't the problem. As you know, FDA accepts 95% of all compassionate use requests that are accepted by companies. And the FDA has a process to review a request within 24 hours and uses it very frequently. I know this because my organization has been involved in several compassionate use requests, and we've seen it occur. So the real problem is not the FDA. The problem is companies that decline compassionate use requests from terminally ill patients. So I basically disagree also, Diane, with your paradigm. Why do patients request compassionate use? There may be some folks looking at snake oil, but oftentimes the issue is that the patients who are seeking compassionate use are patients who can't get on trial because there are no trials for them. For example, in the area of cancer drug development, there are almost zero pediatric trials of unapproved drugs. Kids only get trials after drugs are approved, which is a problem for terminally ill kids, right? Because we know there are some unapproved drugs that are very promising, and we're seeing exciting results, and we know these drugs won't be approved for 5 or 10 years, and all these kids are going to die. They won't have a chance to have these drugs. So that's the reality. The problem is not the FDA. The problem is companies who elect not to share these drugs with, for example, children, because it doesn't comport with their fiduciary responsibilities to their shareholders.
Right, and because of liability. I mean,
and because of liability, because they're worried that a dead kid is going to slow down the FDA approval process on the adult indication. So I guess my question is twofold then. If companies are concerned about opening pediatric trials, for example, in the cancer space, what company would ever, under the right to try law, agree to provide a drug to a terminally ill patient when they don't even have FDA consent to this particular patient's access to the drug? It's riskier for the company than going under compassionate use. That's my first question. But my second question, which is really the one I'm more interested in, is Colorado talking about ways to push companies to give patients opportunity to try drugs? And are you looking at that question that companies really say no too often? Are you asking companies to track how often they say no? Are you thinking about a third-party institution to review compassionate use requests instead of companies? Or are you looking at other mechanisms to address this really serious problem, which is companies keep on saying no, when maybe we as a society might say yes?
Very good questions. First, you're right, as a practical matter, it may not change anything, because if I ran a drug company, I would say, shoot, no, as long as the FDA requires this, I'm not going to do it. So we don't know. And even as I said before, the proponents of this bill don't know if it's going to lead to any practical change. We pass laws all the time, though we know that that's not going to lead to practical change. But then what you're asking, the second part of your question is, are you asking us to respond to a belief that there's too much government involvement in this decision and answer it by requiring more government involvement? That is, government saying to drug companies, we want to incentivize you, coerce you, do something to get you to provide it. And I think those two things become, again, completely inconsistent. If the philosophy is less government intervention, then that would not suggest that we ought to do, and so far no one I know is suggesting, that we do something, try to force or encourage drug companies to provide those.
You know, many deaths are tragedies, especially when they happen to children. But we cannot prevent all of them. It's just not given to us as a species. I think there's a lot of marketing of that belief in this country that with enough research, death itself can be defeated, I would say, is not hyperbolic in terms of how people feel in this country. But it's not true. It's not true. So there are children who are going to die of diseases we don't have treatment for. There are adults who are going to die of diseases we don't have effective treatment for. And eventually, every one of us is going to die, no matter how much of our budget we put into research. So is it good public policy to feed that fantasy? I don't know. There are many other public goods that are also important.
Do we have any other questions? Right here.
I'm sorry, I feel compelled to respond to that. We're not trying to prevent death. Right. We're trying to prevent cancer death in children. There's a big difference between a child looking for some kind of answer to survive, or a 25-year-old, or as you mentioned, a 32-year-old with 3 kids. There's not really a sense here that this program is to keep people alive forever. It's more a sense of dying a different way, or a less painful way, or having options to have a life worth living.
Absolutely. I am totally in favor of all of those things and work every day to achieve that. Giving people things that are untested and unproven, I'm not sure is an example of that. If it's something that has promise in adults but hasn't been approved in children, I'd be all for that. But something that's never been tested in anyone of any age, I think that's dangerous. I think that's snake oil.
In the middle, David?
Hi, thank you. This is a great conversation. It strikes me that the whole point of setting up an FDA or a regulatory body is to protect the public's interest. And in particular, in this case, what strikes me is interesting is that the terminally ill are some of our most vulnerable members of society who are dealing with some of the things that you've mentioned. And it strikes me that this is when the time that you actually want the most regulatory support and defense to prevent them from being taken advantage of in some way, or their families. And it strikes me that the vulnerability, if we allow this to our very vulnerable members of society, that we should allow it for everybody in Colorado, right? So that everybody should be able to try whatever they want. It strikes me that why not let anybody take any medicines they want outside of the bureaucratic regulatory?
Well, there are actually some people who say that the foundation in Arizona that supports this legislation, that in fact is their aim.
And there are plenty of people not in that foundation, but Coloradans who think, yeah, I don't want government telling me what I can ingest or not if I think it'll either prolong my life or just make me feel better. There's certainly that argument. And I do agree that there is an appropriate point for government regulation, and in fact, government intrusion. If we have a child who's suffering, whether from a terminal disease like leukemia, or maybe has been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, we don't let the parent say, we're going to treat this child with prayer because that's what we believe in. We don't want to provide a drug that we know will work, or that you think will work, because we have something that we think will work just as well. We do get involved, so I don't think anyone is, at least I'm not arguing that we should not have some ability to protect those who are most vulnerable, like children. We do need to protect them. And the whole question, again, comes down to the matter of degree and line drawing. How many stages, how much time, how much testing is enough? Some would argue we have way too much, and some would say we still don't have enough because some drugs get through that process and still cause harm and still lead to costly litigation.
We have a few more minutes if there's another question, but we don't. I think this has been a terrific conversation now. All right, well, I would like to thank our panelists, and we look forward to seeing you all tomorrow, including many conversations that I think will be more cheerful than this one. Thank you very much.